Just before sunrise, long before the palace stirred with its usual choreography of routine and ritual, something far more unsettling unfolded behind closed doors. The walls of Clarence House, built to protect secrets, instead bore witness to a moment that would ripple through every chamber of power in the kingdom. A royal aide, assigned to early morning duty, paused in the hallway upon hearing a soft, trembling voice carried through the corridor. "They mustn't find out, Charles, please, stop them." It was Queen Camilla, barely holding her composure, pleading in desperation to her husband, King Charles. Her voice cracked under the weight of fear, not just for her reputation, but for something far greater, something hidden, something that threatened the very stability of the monarchy itself. The aide stood frozen, realizing that this was no ordinary disagreement between sovereign and consort. This was panic. This was dread. Within hours, the same aide relayed what they heard to a trusted figure within the House of Lords, a whisper that rapidly turned into a wildfire. The timing couldn't have been worse. Parliament had already begun circling a decades-old rumor, like vultures over a forgotten battlefield. For weeks, there had been murmurs of sealed documents, ones that if opened could fracture the myth of the Queen's carefully curated life. These weren't idle threats. Committees were forming. Names were being summoned. Quiet nods were exchanged in corridors of power. Camilla's past was no longer just gossip. It had become a target. Inside the palace, her behavior shifted dramatically. The Queen, usually poised and icy with a confidence polished by years of public scrutiny, had grown jittery. Her staff noticed her wandering the halls at odd hours, clutching notes, burning papers in the fireplace of her private quarters, and canceling long-standing engagements with vague excuses. Some said she seemed haunted. Others whispered that she had been receiving anonymous letters, old names, old memories, resurfacing like ghosts, refusing to be silenced. King Charles, caught between the woman he had loved against all odds and the crown he swore to protect, found himself paralyzed. To shield her would be to defy Parliament, to fuel an already blazing firestorm. But to step back would be to betray a loyalty forged long before he wore the crown. Behind the scenes, he made desperate calls to trusted advisors, probing for loopholes, hoping for any path that wouldn't involve total exposure. And then came the official blow. A formal notice from Parliament arrived, sealed in crimson wax, and delivered not with discretion, but with theatrical precision during a formal dinner attended by dignitaries. The letter demanded full cooperation from the Crown regarding unresolved matters pertaining to Queen Camilla's premarital associations and financial record. Camilla's hand trembled as she read it. Her face was drained of color. No one at the table dared to breathe. But what exactly is in Camilla's past that could bring down the monarchy, and why now? It was a simple envelope, thin and unassuming, stamped only with the word confidential across its seal. But by the time its contents had been read aloud in a closed-door meeting of the House of Lords, the room had fallen into stunned, electric silence. What was inside wasn't merely a political threat, it was a direct hit aimed at the heart of the monarchy. The allegations were explosive. Lines of typed accusations laid out in cold, clinical language alleging that Queen Camilla, long before she ever stepped into royal life, had been deeply entangled with a powerful socialite family whose name, though largely erased from public memory, once stirred dread across London's elite circles. This family, it claimed, had roots not only in high society but in illicit dealings that reached into the underworld, trafficking influence, laundering wealth, and controlling reputations through intimidation and bribery. And Camilla, it said, was not just a bystander. She was, at one time, allegedly the one they trusted to handle what they couldn't afford to be traced. The letter, unsigned and typed on an old Remington font with no fingerprints or DNA traceable, was addressed directly to a senior MP known for his anti-monarchist leanings. That MP had reportedly sat with it for 2 days in disbelief, before finally surrendering it to the Lords. Inside, another bombshell. Mention of missing marriage records from Camilla's early years, and unregistered financial transactions involving cash payments in Switzerland. Some lines were redacted in black, almost as if to tease the depths yet to be revealed. Others were left cruelly exposed, like the name of a man believed to have once shared a bank account with Camilla during a time when she was officially living under another name. But the most chilling part? A handwritten postscript on a separate piece of paper tucked into the folds of the envelope. A simple line. She knows who I am. Tell her I haven't forgotten what she promised me in 1982. The implications were devastating. Was someone blackmailing the Queen? Was this the resurfacing of a pact made in desperation decades ago? And more importantly, what was promised and why was the threat being activated now? Parliament moved fast. A call to form a special inquiry commission was issued within hours. This wasn't a quiet request, it was a thunderclap through the British establishment. Select lords, MPs, and intelligence liaisons were appointed to assess the legitimacy of the letter. Meanwhile, the media caught the scent. Headlines blared rumors of a dark dossier on the Queen. The palace refused to comment, but internally, a storm was already erupting. Charles was briefed by his most senior advisors, and the message was brutal in its clarity. Refusal to comply with the inquiry could erode public trust and rip open a constitutional crisis that no monarch could survive. As the parliament presses forward, Camilla's composure begins to crack, and behind palace doors, chaos brews. The Queen, who once ruled the palace with icy control, was now sobbing behind velvet drapes, clutching a letter and whispering, "They'll ruin everything I built." Camilla, once the unshakable force behind the throne, was crumbling under the weight of a truth she had spent decades burying. The investigation was no longer speculation. It was real, sanctioned, and intensifying by the day. With every hour, whispers turned into formal accusations, and that meant the clock on her secrets was ticking louder than ever. Those who had once feared her now looked on with pity as she shrank into silence, her regal poise replaced by paranoia and desperation. She stopped attending royal functions, cancelled meetings, and shuttered her private wing of the palace. Staff were instructed not to knock unless summoned. Meals went untouched. Her world, once calculated and carefully curated, was unraveling at a terrifying pace. Behind those walls, her behavior grew erratic. Loyal aides who had stood by her through the Diana years, through Charles's coronation, through every moment of scrutiny were now on the receiving end of her sharpest barbs. She accused them of spying, leaking, even betrayal. Some wept, others resigned. But most stayed, not out of duty, but because they sensed something catastrophic was about to unfold. Only one person seemed to break through the storm, her daughter, Laura Lopes. Camilla clung to her like a lifeline, whispering frantic confessions in the dead of night, urging her to never speak of the past, no matter what they show you. Laura, visibly shaken, tried to be a pillar for her mother, but began asking questions of her own about the man in the photos, without a name, about the letters tucked into the old jewelry box, and about the one word Camilla mumbled in her sleep, over and over again, "Martin." Desperate for clarity, Camilla returned to the few remnants of her old life. The diaries she once locked away, the photo albums hidden in the third drawer beneath her scarves, and the stack of letters bound in twine from the 1980s. There, she lingered for hours, tracing the edges of memories she could no longer outrun. Her greatest fear wasn't public shame. It was the resurfacing of truths too twisted, too tangled, too impossible to explain. Relationships built on manipulation, choices made under duress. Deals she believed had long since vanished from record. But the past, as she now realized, does not forgive forgetting. It waits. She began to feel it closing in, that every whisper in the hall was a judgment, that every shift in Charles's expression was doubtful. She could no longer tell who was protecting her and who was preparing to distance themselves. And then came the final unraveling when she screamed the name Martin during an especially restless night. Palace aides exchanged glances. No one knew who he was, but the urgency in her voice suggested he was the one person who could dismantle everything. And just as Camilla's fear reaches a peak, Charles makes a move that changes everything. In a clandestine late-night meeting at Downing Street, King Charles slid a folder across the table and said, "This goes no further. Parliament doesn't need to know." It was a last-ditch effort, veiled in civility but loaded with desperation. The man who had spent a lifetime preparing for the throne now found himself cornered not by foreign enemies or internal rivals, but by the past of the woman he had fought so hard to legitimize. The folder contained carefully selected files, ancestral records, ceremonial documents, even restricted communications related to his mother's final months. each page a token of transparency, meant to distract, to deflect. But notably absent were any documents tied to Camilla, and that, Charles insisted, was non-negotiable. Across from him, the Prime Minister was stone-faced, torn between upholding the public's right to truth and protecting the crumbling dignity of the monarchy. He understood the stakes. The crown was the last unifying relic of Britain's post-imperial identity. But he also knew this storm would not pass quietly. Charles pleaded not as a monarch, but as a husband. He painted Camilla not as a threat, but as a vulnerable woman at the mercy of a vengeful system. "She'll be devoured," he said quietly. "Not because she's guilty, but because people want her to be." For a moment, there was silence. But before any resolution could be reached, the very secrecy of the meeting betrayed them. A senior Parliament official, whether out of conscience, ambition, or revenge, leaked the encounter to the press. By dawn, headlines were ablaze with fury. "The King intervenes. What are they hiding? Monarchy blocks Parliament." Within hours, protesters had gathered outside Westminster and Buckingham Palace alike, waving signs that screamed, "Transparency now and Camilla must testify." The public was no longer just curious, they were incensed. Social media erupted. Talk shows hosted fiery debates. Political analysts warned of a brewing constitutional rift. Some argued that Charles had overstepped his authority, resurrecting old wounds about royal privilege and unchecked power. Others sympathized, pointing to the trauma his family had endured in the public eye. But sympathy, however loud, was drowned by a roar of suspicion, and Parliament, feeling its authority challenged, doubled down. A revised motion was passed to expedite the inquiry, giving investigators broader powers to access sealed archives, even those previously protected by royal privilege. For the first time in decades, the illusion of harmony between the monarchy and the state was shattered. Private conversations became public scandals, lines of loyalty blurred. The Prime Minister, once quietly allied with Charles, now found himself under fire from his own party for even entertaining a deal. The palace, meanwhile, was spiraling. Staff were briefed to expect resignations, royal advisors prepared contingency plans, and Charles, once the confident steward of the crown, found himself surrounded not by tradition but by landmines. But Camilla's past was never going to stay buried because someone had already begun digging years ago. He vanished from the tabloids decades ago. But now, an ex-journalist named Simon Graves resurfaces with boxes of files labeled CR, for eyes only. For years, his name had been nothing more than a footnote in the world of royal reporting, dismissed as a relic of the gutter press. But to those who remembered, Graves had always hovered too close to the flame. He was the one who knew where the stories ended and the scandals began. Before Diana, before the fairy tale spin of Charles and Camilla, Graves had followed Camilla's every move long before she was crowned, back when her past was still being rewritten to fit a royal narrative. And now, with the monarchy in chaos, he had chosen to speak. What he brought with him wasn't conjecture, it was documentation. Hundreds of pages of old interviews never aired, blurry Polaroids stamped with dates, and most damning of all, handwritten letters bearing Camilla's initials. One of them, allegedly addressed to an unnamed confidant, spoke of the deal and a need to protect the account in Geneva at all costs. It was the kind of line that sent chills down Parliament's spine. Among the files was a single sheet that showed a financial transaction connecting Camilla's alias from the early 80s to an offshore trust account registered in the Cayman Islands. The recipient? A law firm was later exposed for laundering money for British elites. Graves, pale and visibly ill, admitted during a hush-hush interview that he had been paid handsomely in 1,996, an envelope of cash delivered by a man he identified only as Mr. L to bury the entire archive. And he almost did, but something stopped him. Whether guilt, foresight, or a deeper vendetta, he held onto the files, storing them in a locked chest beneath the floorboards of his Essex home. And now, facing the end of his life, Graves had no reason left to protect anyone. Word of his reappearance spread like wildfire. Parliament acted swiftly, calling Graves to testify in a private session. It was unprecedented. For the first time, the royal family faced the very real possibility that a civilian once deemed a tabloid nuisance held a match that could ignite the entire institution. Camilla, upon hearing the name, reportedly froze. She knew exactly who Simon Graves was. And more importantly, she knew what he had. What Parliament didn't yet know was that Graves had one more card to play an audio recording, one he hadn't yet revealed. And while the royal family braced for the consequences of his testimony, the next revelation wasn't going to come from the outside at all. It was coming from inside the palace, from those who had served in silence, until now. As Graves prepares to go public, the royal family scrambles, but the next bombshell comes from inside the palace. "They forced us to stay quiet for years," one former staff member says tearfully. "But after what we saw, we couldn't anymore." The silence that had once insulated Queen Camilla from scandal was beginning to collapse, not from outside pressure, but from within the very palace she ruled. Former aides, once sworn to secrecy under threats of legal action and lifelong loyalty, were finally breaking ranks. Whispers turned into confessions, and soon confessions became testimonies. What started as a single anonymous statement quickly unraveled into a coordinated outcry. Several staffers, many of them retired, began speaking to journalists under pseudonyms, and their stories were disturbingly consistent. They spoke of late-night visits by unidentified guests whom Camilla met behind locked doors. Visitors whose names were never logged and whose faces were never captured by palace records. Staff claimed they were told never to mention these meetings, even when they occurred multiple times a week. Some recalled being asked to leave their posts early, only to later find traces of shredded documents in the fireplaces, and once, the distinct smell of burnt film. One former assistant said she was ordered to erase call records tied to international phone numbers, some of which matched contacts later linked to foreign lobbying networks and major political donors. No explanations. No clarifications, just the expectation of silence. But the most chilling detail came from those who remembered Camilla's obsession with a specific object, a small red leather notebook. It was always within reach, even at public events. Locked away in her personal drawer, guarded like a royal relic. Staff claimed she would grow frantic if it ever went missing for even a moment. One housemaid recounted an incident in 2014 where Camilla screamed at her for merely brushing against the drawer where it was kept. That notebook, according to some, contained names of people from her past who held leverage, who had history, and who, if exposed, could shatter the entire royal illusion. What was in it? No one ever saw, but its destruction became an obsession. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Camilla once demanded a safe be installed beneath her bedroom floor, exclusively for the notebook. And then came a name long believed buried Diana. Several aides revealed that in her final months, the late princess had made a cryptic remark during a private event. Camilla's afraid because she knows what she's done, and she knows someone still remembers. At the time, it was dismissed as tension, but now, that line echoed with new, haunting significance. The pressure became unbearable. One brave soul, a current palace insider, contacted Parliament directly. The message was simple but thunderous. "If you want the truth, you're looking in the wrong places. Look here, inside." With this, Camilla was no longer simply the subject of an external probe. She was cornered, surrounded by the ghosts of her past, and the witnesses who had finally decided to speak. But just when the investigation tightens, an unexpected defender rises, and it's not who anyone expected. In a shocking twist, Princess Catherine publicly urges Parliament to proceed with dignity, a move that leaves Charles speechless and Camilla devastated. No one expected her to speak. Not now. Not in the midst of the most volatile scandal the modern monarchy had ever faced. Yet, with calm, precision, and unshakable grace, Catherine released a statement that would alter the trajectory of the royal crisis overnight. She did not mention Camilla by name, nor did she point fingers. But her words carried the weight of finality. No institution can endure without accountability, not even the crown. In that moment, Catherine shattered the long-standing tradition of silence and solidarity, and the world listened. Her words were not merely those of a princess. They were the voice of a future queen speaking to a wounded nation. Days later, she was spotted leaving a discreet meeting with two senior advisors once close to Queen Elizabeth II, men known for safeguarding the late monarch's moral compass. Cameras caught the brief exchange, and speculation erupted instantly. Was Catherine now channeling the spirit of the Queen herself? Was this a subtle coronation of a different kind? One not bound by tiaras, but by conscience? To the public, she had become something else entirely, not just a royal, a reckoning. But inside the palace, her interventions struck like a lightning bolt. Camilla, already frayed and fragile, saw the move as a calculated betrayal. She reportedly erupted in private, calling Catherine's statement treason in disguise and accusing her of aligning with those determined to erase everything Camilla had fought to build. The tension between the two women, long buried beneath rehearsed smiles and forced photo ops, had finally broken the surface. And for once, it wasn't Camilla commanding the court of public opinion. Charles, torn between his queen and his daughter-in-law, said nothing. His silence was deafening. Privately, he confronted William, hoping his son might intervene. But William, despite his own reservations, refused to restrain Catherine. He urged caution, warned of political firestorms, and asked that she remain quiet moving forward. But it was too late. The statement had already spread globally. Across dinner tables, newsrooms, and parliaments alike, people asked the same question. If Catherine was willing to break rank, what else was still being hidden? The royal family, already staggering under the weight of scandal, now found itself cracked from within. Supporters of Catherine hailed her as a symbol of integrity. Detractors accused her of exploiting the crisis for personal ascent. But either way, the effect was undeniable. Parliament, emboldened by the statement, moved to fast-track their inquiry. What had begun as political hesitation transformed into moral obligation. The crown, once insulated by tradition, was now exposed to the unforgiving light of public judgment. And just as the royal family fractures further, a long-sealed royal document is leaked, and the contents are beyond devastating. The royal archives were supposed to remain sealed for 50 years. But one document made its way into a reporter's hands, and it was named Camilla directly. The leak didn't come through Parliament, nor from the palace. It came from deep within the labyrinth of classified royal files, tucked away in a collection known as Queen Elizabeth's Private Security Memoirs, a name whispered among senior courtiers but never confirmed. The file, marked with the Queen's personal cipher, was never meant to be seen by the public. It detailed risk assessments, personal reflections, and unfiltered commentary on figures close to the royal family. And within those pages, under the heading 1982, 1989, Affiliations of Concern, the name Camilla Parker Bowles appeared. What followed was nothing short of a political earthquake. The document alleged that Camilla had, during the height of her premarital social influence, associated with individuals considered political extremists, figures linked to fringe lobbying groups and underground financial circles. It outlined a series of private meetings, some of which were never publicly acknowledged, and detailed allegations that she had received undisclosed financial gifts from a now-defunct holding company based in Gibraltar. The memo didn't accuse her of criminal activity, but it warned of something potentially more dangerous: reputational volatility. The subject's past may present a long-term public risk if marriage to the heir is pursued. The Queen had written in cautious but unmistakable terms. The question that immediately followed was simple: why hadn't Elizabeth acted? And the answer, though unstated, was painfully clear: love. The Queen, known for her strategic foresight and icy discipline, had perhaps allowed herself one moment of maternal concession. To preserve Charles's happiness, she buried her concerns. She shelved the memo. She said nothing. And in doing so, she made a decision that now, years later, had returned to haunt the institution she had spent her life protecting. Camilla, already besieged by scandal, was confronted behind closed doors by a senior parliamentary committee. The file was placed on the table. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages because she knew what was inside. She didn't argue. She didn't deny. She simply sat in silence. That silence, in itself, was a confession. A woman once feared for her steel now appeared undone, stripped bare by words written long ago in a queen's private journal. Across the country, reaction was swift and merciless. Public trust in the monarchy plummeted. Protests flared once more, this time with placards not just condemning Camilla, but questioning the monarchy's very survival. News programs dissected every line of the file. Parliament prepared for an emergency session, and Charles, blindsided, reportedly wept in solitude, caught between the ghost of his mother's caution and the ruinous truth of his wife's past. Now, with her past exposed and the crown under fire, Camilla makes a final, desperate move that no one saw coming. In a trembling voice before cameras, Camilla speaks, "I did things I'm not proud of, but I never thought it would destroy the monarchy." The moment was raw, stripped of protocol, and unlike anything the British public had ever witnessed from a reigning queen. There were no gilded walls or palace fanfare, only a somber backdrop and a woman at the center of a storm finally confronting the wreckage. Her voice faltered as she began, yet there was an eerie steadiness beneath the surface, as if she had rehearsed these lines 1,000 times in her head but never imagined she'd be forced to say them out loud. She offered what many described as a half-apology, an admission of past associations, regrettable decisions, and what she called naive entanglements from a different life. Camilla acknowledged relationships that, in her words, now appear questionable in hindsight, and financial decisions she claimed were misunderstood and never intended to mislead. Yet, she drew a firm line. She would not resign. She would not step away from her role. To walk away now, she said, would be to let the crown fall with me. I will not be the reason this institution collapses. It was a mixture of sorrow, defiance, and a final attempt to reclaim control of a narrative that had long spiraled beyond her grasp. Behind the scenes, Charles stood silently, watching from the shadows. According to those present, his face was etched with disbelief. This was not the woman he married. This was someone else. Someone exhausted by secrets and hardened by survival. Some said he wept. Others said he looked hollow, like a king left standing on the ashes of a broken kingdom. But he said nothing. Just watched, helplessly, as his wife fought a battle no one could win. Elsewhere, the reactions were as divided as the country itself. Catherine, reportedly watching the broadcast in private, broke into tears and told a close aide, "It's too little." Too late. Her silence afterward only fueled speculation that the divide between her and Camilla had become irreparable. Meanwhile, public response was seismic. Supporters hailed Camilla's bravery to face the nation, calling her a survivor of brutal political sabotage. Others, however, were ruthless, accusing her of manipulative theatrics, of dodging full accountability, and of disgracing the throne with arrogance disguised as strength. Protests reignited across major cities. Parliament confirmed the inquiry would continue this time with full access to previously restricted royal records. In pubs, homes, and newsrooms, debates turned into shouting matches. Some called for reform, others called for abdication. And still, in the midst of it all, Camilla remained unmoved, neither redeemed nor ruined, but trapped in a legacy forever altered. But even as the dust settles, whispers continue because some say what Parliament uncovered wasn't even the darkest part of Camilla's past. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.